There are mornings in Oxford that seem to have slipped in from an older century. You'll be walking the cobbled paths near the colleges, and a mist will hang like an undecided thought above the stone, and a raven on a turret will stretch its wings without leaving. That Sunday had the weight of such a morning, quiet, unbeckoned, and finely dusted with the scent of early autumn. But something else was absent too. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to notice. It was the bells. I was crossing Broad Street, the ache in my left knee reminding me I'd taken the stairs too quickly the day before, when I glanced at the Tower of All Saints and paused. It was nearly 8, and the hour had passed without the chime. No echo through the quad, no minor tremor in the stone. Just a silence so perfect that it disguised itself as peace. I looked up at the belfry, where the windows blinked against the grey sky, and felt, in that irrational way I sometimes do, that something had ended. Bells don't simply forget to toll in Oxford. Time is measured here not by the ticking of wrists, but by the weight of centuries pressing themselves into routine. And yet, there it was, the unspoken. It might have been nothing, and I might have let it remain so, had it not been for the porter. He was sitting just inside the gate, wrapped in a scarf and a mood, coughing softly into a handkerchief. Not the dry, polite kind of cough that says cold air has passed through a wool collar. This was deeper, hollowed out. He caught my glance and gave a small, uncertain nod, then looked away as though embarrassed to be seen. The rest of the walk was uneventful. A blackbird startled from a hedge near Brasenose. A student, or perhaps a ghost of one, passed me muttering lines from what I assumed was Marlowe, though the cadence was muddied by cider and self-importance. I took my usual seat at the Randolph, far corner, near the fire that someone always thoughtfully lights, even when the chill hasn't quite earned it. Lewis was meant to join me, but he rang to say he'd overslept, a rare admission, and one I didn't entirely believe. I lingered over my breakfast longer than usual, read a piece in the Times about the restoration of an early manuscript in Prague. There was something moving in the idea of monks binding silence into vellum, trusting time to forget its hunger. Still no bells. By 11, I'd made my way back toward the Bodleian, and still All Saints remained mute. I remember pausing beside a group of tourists, their guide gesturing with mechanical cheer toward the Radcliffe camera. She said something about enlightenment and architecture. One of them asked whether Tolkien had studied there, and the guide, without hesitation, said yes. I kept walking. It wasn't until later that the silence took on its true shape. But even then, there had been a hint. A single thread pulling somewhere beneath the skin, and it lay in a detail that bothered me more than I allowed myself to admit. On my way past the chapel, I'd noticed the gate to the bell tower slightly ajar. A rusted iron hinge, usually kept locked, had been recently oiled. The smell of it was sharp, too modern, a chemical whisper against the more dignified aromas of damp stone and beeswax polish. And beneath the arch, where the gravel gave way to flagstone, someone had scuffed away a line of moss with their heel. Not deliberately, but unconsciously, as if waiting for something. Or someone. I might have gone in then, might have followed that instinct that sometimes arrives not as curiosity, but as discomfort. But I didn't. I passed through, as I always did, and let the silence fall behind me like a cloak being drawn. If I had turned back then, if I had stood a moment longer beneath that tower, watched the porter's eyes more carefully, or asked the simplest question, perhaps it would have unfolded differently. Perhaps. But regret, like the bells that morning, waits for no one to listen. It was Lewis who mentioned it, his voice carrying that careful tone he reserves for things he doesn't yet know how to judge. He'd phoned shortly after midday, his words pausing as if waiting for mine to arrive first. "Have you seen the mail this morning?" I hadn't. I told him so. He hesitated. Dean of All Saints. Dead. They're calling it suicide. Pills, apparently. I remember standing quite still at that, as if the floor had stiffened beneath my shoes. Not surprise, not yet, but the strange displacement that comes when the world insists on providing a coincidence just as you are beginning to think in metaphors. The bells. I said I'd meet him at the college. No sirens, no fuss. Oxford doesn't do spectacle when the dead belong to the cloth or the faculty, especially not both. It was late afternoon by the time I passed back through the arched gateway of All Saints. The porter, the same man from that hushed morning, offered a nod this time. His cough, if it remained, was buried in wool and tact. A black ribbon had been tied around the post of the main stairwell. A small act of mourning, I suppose, though it felt less funereal than theatrical. The sort of symbolism people mistake for grace. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp sermons and furniture polish. Lewis met me by the long corridor that led to the dean's rooms. He looked unusually neat, as though death required starching one's collar. He said very little, only that the body had been found by the housekeeper just before breakfast, door locked from within, no signs of violence. The physician had confirmed barbiturates, and so they were saying suicide. I asked if a note had been found. Lewis gave a small shrug. Apparently not. Just the body, the bottle, and a bedside clock that had stopped at some undecided point in the night. We stepped into the dean's rooms, large, wood-panelled and draped with the melancholy that follows scholarship. A pair of brown brogues sat neatly beneath the desk, as if still waiting to be worn. On the mantelpiece, a photograph of a young man in graduation robes, too distant to identify but surrounded by 4 others whose faces had been obscured by dust or deliberate neglect. I didn't ask. The bed was made, tightly, ritualistically, except for the place where the body had lain. That space had been carefully cleared, the sheets replaced. A ritual, again. Oxford tends to preserve dignity even where none was offered. I noticed something then, something faint. A folded square of paper was lying beneath the chair by the window. Not a note, a lecture outline, typed and corrected in neat, inked marginalia. The title read, Silence and Subversion, Dramatic Voids in Jacobean Thought. It was to be delivered that very evening at the start of Macalmer's term. I scanned it briefly. Erudite, provocative, and, somewhere near the middle, faintly accusatory. A passage referencing the politics of omission. I underlined it with my thumb. Then I noticed the pagination. Pages 1 through 6, then 8. 7 was missing. I tucked the pages inside my coat. Not theft, preservation. The housekeeper wouldn't know what to make of it, and the bursar would sooner bury it with the laundry. Lewis had begun checking the drawers, carefully, not rummaging. He found a small notebook of literary quotations, handwritten and indexed. I glanced at it. One entry had been underlined with force. Silence is the unbearable repartee. I said it aloud without meaning to. Lewis looked up. What's that? I told him it was from Chesterton, or Wilde. Possibly both or neither. It was the sort of aphorism that Oxford breeds like mildew. We left the room without closing the door. I needed air and perhaps something stronger. Back on the quad, the bells were ringing again, late, perhaps, or out of sympathy, their chimes scattered against the stone like marbles spilt in a corridor, clumsy, echoing, unclaimed. Lewis lit a cigarette. He asked whether I believed it. The suicide. I watched the sun slip behind the chapel spire. Not yet, I said. Not quite. And in my mind, the silence from the day before chimed louder than anything the bells could conjure. The door to the lecture theatre had been left ajar, though the event itself had been cancelled hours earlier. A printed notice, curling at the edges, informed the absent crowd that the dean's lecture will not be delivered this evening due to unforeseen circumstances. The words carried the pallor of euphemism, as if language itself were recoiling from proximity to the truth. Oxford does that well, embalms fact in formality, hides grief in clauses. Inside, the air had settled into stillness. The chairs, a neat crescent of polished wood, waited with an almost devotional hush, as though reluctant to acknowledge their audience had failed to materialize. The lectern stood solitary beneath a dust-softened spotlight. There was something faintly ecclesiastical in the arrangement, or judicial. The notes had not been cleared away. A sheaf of typewritten pages, clipped at the corner, rested where the dean must have placed them. I picked them up without asking permission. No one else was there to give it. It was a strange feeling, reading the words aloud, silently, of a man whose voice had already been erased. The title was more pointed than I'd expected. Silence and Subversion, Dramatic Voids in Jacobean Thought. A scholar's phrasing, but sharpened. This had not been intended as a mere recital of academic observation. There was a subtle anger in it, controlled but insistent, a kind of intellectual reckoning. The first few pages tracked familiar terrain: Marston's Antonio's Revenge, Tourneur's Revenger's Tragedy, the peculiar weight of unspoken threats in Middleton. I followed the rhythm easily enough, but midway through the 5th page, the tone shifted. Elphick, the dean, began to edge into something else. A passage that described those unrecorded silences where intention withers and something darker grows. There was no citation. Only the phrase itself, underlined once in blue ink. It was page 6 that caught me. A handwritten correction, not in the margin but interleaved into the line itself, had altered a quote. The original read, "Oaths are the ornaments of liars." The insertion, in a lighter hand, changed it to, "Silence is the oath that cannot be revoked." I stood there, unsure if I had encountered arrogance or desperation. Either can look like insight, and then came the absence. Page 7, missing, not clipped askew or misnumbered. Gone. I checked again. Page 6, then page 8. As though the 7th had either never existed or had been deliberately removed, either by the dean himself in a moment of doubt or by someone else in a moment of fear. I looked up and for the first time noticed the arrangement of the chairs. The front row had one seat shifted ever so slightly askew, its legs tilted just beyond the symmetry of the others. It wasn't much. Perhaps the cleaner had caught it or some early attendee had fidgeted. But it broke the room's logic. I walked over and pressed the legs back into line, the noise echoing more than I'd intended. Behind me, the door creaked, and I turned to find the bursar standing there, arms folded, as though she'd been waiting for me to notice her. She said it was a pity. The dean had been looking forward to the lecture. I asked if she'd read it. She said no, that wasn't her role. She handled budgets, not ideas. I held up the missing page, or rather gestured at its absence. "Curious," I said, "that this one's missing." She didn't flinch. Perhaps it had been mislaid, or perhaps it hadn't been written. She had that sort of voice, crisp, deliberate, the kind that makes you forget your own sentences as she speaks. I said nothing else. She left without, turning her back on me, which I noticed. On my way out, I paused by the college notice board. The last poster pinned there advertised the lecture in bold serif. Below it, someone had scribbled a single word in pencil, barely visible beneath the glass cover: unspoken. I might have missed it had the evening light not caught it just so, and it occurred to me then, quite suddenly, that silence, when chosen, can be a kind of confession. There is something peculiarly intimate about a college bell tower. It's not simply the height, though that grants its own quiet dominion, but the narrowness of the space, the sense that time itself is kept here not by machines, but by human breath and slowness. I've never trusted digital clocks. There's a finality to their blinking that admits no hesitation, but a bell waits to be rung. It can forget. It can falter, or it can be silenced. Lewis and I found the bell ringer, eventually, tucked into a lean-to off the side of the chapel cloisters. a shed by every other name, though Oxford prefers its own vocabulary. Inside, a kettle whistled, as if afraid of being ignored. The man who emerged to greet us, Anthony Gwilym, had a face composed mostly of eyebrows and the kind of smile that arrives late and rarely. He apologized before we'd asked anything, said he'd overslept on Sunday. First time in 22 years, offered the confession, like it had already ruined him. There was a sadness to it that made pressing further feel ungenerous. He had no explanation. The alarm hadn't gone off, or perhaps it had, but too softly. His wife had died in January, he added. A stray fact, but not irrelevant. Sometimes grief rearranges the morning. I asked if the key to the tower had been in his possession. He hesitated, eyes darting just slightly. Not guilt, exactly, but a flicker of self-reproach. Said the key had been misplaced 2 weeks earlier. The college porter had the spare. Then, as if remembering something, he added that it had reappeared mysteriously in his coat pocket on Sunday afternoon. Said he'd assumed it had fallen there from the hook. I doubted that. Keys don't climb. I asked where he'd been Saturday night. At home, mostly. A pint at the Crown. Returned early. Too early to have misplaced anything. He looked at me then, properly. Said he'd served 3 deans in his time, and Elphick was the only one who ever climbed the tower himself. Occasionally. Usually at dusk. Said the dean liked to watch the bats pour from the belfry as the light changed. Odd man, he added, but kind. Always left you thinking. On our way out, I noticed a crossword pinned to the wall above the kettle. Half filled. The clue that caught me was 14 across. Keeper of sound faith. 6. He'd written Bella, then crossed it out, uncertain. I stood a moment, then wrote quietly, Verger. Left it unspoken. Back at the porter's lodge, Lewis had managed to extract the logbook. The spare key had indeed been signed out by the bursar on the Friday before the bells fell silent. No notation of its return. Curious, but perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. The porter, a man with the complexion of neglected stone, confirmed it. Said Dr. Rawdon had needed access to the tower for inspection, something about weather damage. Said she hadn't asked before. Just signed and took it. I asked whether that was usual. He said nothing and rubbed his thumb along the margin of the register. The silence answered. It was then that I noticed the college clock, the one above the quad, was 3 minutes fast. Not an obvious detail unless you had the city's rhythm in your bones. But I'd checked my watch beneath the Carfax the same morning, and I'd heard the bells from Magdalen Tower chiming behind me. Time in Oxford has layers, and sometimes discrepancies. I mentioned it to Lewis as we stepped into the main court. He shrugged. Maybe maintenance had fiddled with it. Maybe. But the idea lingered. If the college clock was fast and the bells had failed, then someone, was manipulating not just sound, but sequence, order, ritual. And in Oxford, where the hours are old and the silences are older still, that felt less like a mistake and more like a message. Her voice reached me before her name did. It was dusk again, the hour Oxford performs best, and I had lingered longer than usual beneath the cloisters of the chapel, drawn there not by piety, but by the soft hum of something unresolved. The light through the stained glass had thinned into that particular hue of amber that makes you think of things you never said. I told Lewis I'd meet him later. I needed solitude, though I wouldn't have admitted it aloud. Not then. She was singing something modal, Elgar, or at least something that knew of him, a line that folded in on itself with aching symmetry. The voice was young, yes, but not uncertain. When I entered the nave, the sound retreated into silence, as though startled by its own candor. She stood beside the organ, her fingers grazing the edge of a music stand, not turning as I approached. I asked if she was rehearsing. She said no, that it helped her think. Her name, I would learn, was Clara Jesson, a scholarship soprano, barely 20. Not beautiful in the way magazines claim, but luminous in a manner that made the eye linger. She reminded me of someone I'd once admired and failed, though I couldn't quite remember who. I mentioned I was there about the dean. Her voice didn't waver, but her hand did. Just slightly, enough to disturb a single page of sheet music. It floated downward like something dismissed. She said he'd been kind, that he'd always insisted music was a form of courage. I told her I'd read the lecture, that it hadn't been about drama at all, really, that it was about omission and about guilt. She didn't respond. Instead, she picked up the fallen page and laid it flat again, smoothing its edge with 2 careful fingers. Then she asked, almost absently, whether we thought he'd taken his own life. I said we hadn't concluded anything yet. She nodded, but too quickly. Said she'd seen him in the quad 3 nights before his death, arguing with someone. A woman in academic robes, not shouting, just urgent. Like something rehearsed, but not yet performed. That was the word she used. Performed. Not staged, not said. Performed. As though it were a script neither of them quite believed in. I asked if she knew the woman's name. She didn't. Or said she didn't. Her gaze drifted toward the chapel window, where the glass caught the last of the light. The figure of Saint Cecilia, patron of music and, some would argue, of secrets, looked down at us with faint derision. I changed tack. Asked her if she'd ever been to the bell tower. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Once, she said, on a dare during her first term. It had smelled of rope and pigeon. Why? I told her about the missing key and the silence on Sunday. She seemed thoughtful, not frightened. Then said something I hadn't expected, that the dean had once asked her to sing alone in the tower, to test its echo, said it was for acoustics, said it was research. She hadn't gone. She hadn't wanted to be heard that far above everyone. There was something in that sentence I didn't touch. Instead, I looked around the chapel, noticed for the first time a brass plaque beneath the organ bench. The inscription was faded but legible. To Helen Garside, who sang even when no one listened. Died 1993. I ran the name through the shelves of memory and came up with silence, the kind that is chosen for you. I asked Clara who Helen was. She said nothing for a moment, then told me Helen had once been a student here. Voice like fire. But something happened. She left, or was asked to. No one spoke of it now. The college, Clara said, preferred its ghosts silent. Lewis called just as I stepped out. Said he'd found something. A letter, postmarked a day after the dean's death. Addressed in his hand, sent from the college. Impossible, I said. Unless he hadn't died when they said he had. Unless time, like bells, can lie. Some women wear severity like a perfume. With Judith Rawdon, it lingered in the air long after she had left the room, cool, unobtrusive, and faintly metallic, like the breath of a library vault before the lights come on. She had agreed to meet us, not because she was obliged, but because she disliked the implication that she might be avoiding anything. That, I had already gathered, was her preferred defense. Visibility. One step ahead of suspicion. She received us in her office, a narrow chamber above the south cloister where the window overlooked the chapel roof rather than the quad. A choice, perhaps, or an accident of architecture. The room was spare. No sentimental clutter, no framed degrees. Only a desk with ledgers so precisely stacked they might have been measured with a ruler. A calendar hung askew on the far wall. I noticed it had been turned 2 days ahead. She greeted Lewis first. Her voice was exact, clipped, the kind that had little use for adverbs. Then to me, a slightly longer glance, as if weighing not whether to trust me, but whether I was worth wasting ambiguity on. I told her we were looking to understand the dean's final days, not in the forensic sense, but in the tonal one. She gave a small nod, barely perceptible. She said Marcus Elphick had been brilliant and difficult, which in Oxford are often synonyms, that he had made enemies, though mostly through indifference, that his death was tragic but unsurprising. Some minds, she added, reach their conclusion long before the body does. She spoke with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed grief. I asked if they had argued recently. Her expression shifted, but not in the way most would read. It was less guilt than memory. She said they had disagreed about a donor's request to digitize the older archives. Elphick had objected, citing dignity, privacy, and what he called the sacred erosion of ink. She had called him a romantic, which he hadn't minded. But the conversation had turned. That was the word she used. Turned. I asked whether she had seen him the night before he died. She said no, then yes, then qualified both answers. He had left a note in her pigeonhole. Not a suicide note, she stressed, merely a line of verse and an unsigned draft of his lecture. The verse, she said, was from Cymbeline. She didn't quote it. Lewis had taken a chair in the corner, half hidden by a lamp with a crooked shade. He asked whether she had checked in on him after the note. She said no. That would have been an intrusion. Oxford, after all, respects thresholds. I almost smiled. Then, as we were preparing to leave, I noticed something on her desk. Not a letter, a crossword, folded inside a budget printout. It was half solved. The pen strokes are sharp, almost etched. I asked whether she did them often. She shrugged, said it helped her think laterally. The clue that caught me was 9 down, 1 held in trust, bound by silence, 6. She had written FAI-, then paused, said she hadn't solved it yet. I told her it might be faith. She tilted her head, said that would be too easy. Before we left, she handed me a document, said it was Elphick's most recent amendment to his will, submitted to the college registrar, but not yet finalized. I took it with the kind of care one usually reserves for relics. She warned it was delicate reading, that Marcus had named a new beneficiary. Not her, someone else. She wouldn't say who. As I stepped into the stairwell, I turned the document in my hand. There was something strange about the signature. Not its content, but its placement, slightly off-center, a line too far to the left. The kind of error Elphick would never make unless he had been distracted. Or dying. Lewis asked what I made of her. I said she was the sort of woman who solves puzzles in ink, but never allows herself to erase a mistake. He nodded. Said he hadn't liked the calendar. Neither had I. 2 days ahead, I said. What's she rushing toward? Or, Lewis said, what's she hiding behind? It was a fair question. Oxford, after all, is a place where time behaves, but only when you're not looking too closely. The chapel was colder than usual that evening. Cold in the way that seeps upward through stone until it occupies the body before one realizes. I'd gone there not for prayer, but because Lewis had asked me to look again at the organ. He'd been poking about after evensong, and something in his voice over the phone had carried that particular tremor between embarrassment and importance. He said he might have found something. The place was empty when I arrived. Candles half burned in their holders, leaving curls of wax along the ledge. The faint smell of incense still clung to the air, mingled with the tang of polished brass. I walked slowly up the aisle, each step echoing in triplicate. The pipes of the organ loomed above me like sentinels of a silent army, each one mute, waiting. Lewis was standing awkwardly by the keyboard, as though guilty of trespass. He gestured without words. Beneath the lid, tucked into the shadows where the wood joined, lay a folded sheet of paper. I drew it out carefully. The paper was creased, the kind of creases that come from repeated folding and unfolding, as if someone had hesitated between concealment and revelation. The ink was faint, typed on an old machine. Not the neat print of modern convenience, but the slight irregularity of a ribbon on its last legs. It was a draft. Page 7, the missing piece of Elphic's lecture. The opening line quoted Marlowe, though not accurately. Whoever loved that loved not at first sight. The misquotation jarred me. I knew the true line, of course. I had underlined it myself once in an old anthology. Love, not silence. Whoever loved that loved not at first sight. A deliberate distortion or a slip of memory. Beneath it, a Latin phrase, bellum silentium. I mouthed it to myself. War of silence. A contradiction, yet not. Silence can be the sharpest weapon. Lewis shifted beside me. He said he hadn't read it all, thought it better I did. His honesty is sometimes more valuable than his caution. The text was unfinished. Sentences broken off. References to omissions, to voices denied the stage, and a line underlined twice. Some truths are told only in the absence of sound. I thought of Clara Jesson's hesitant words, her memory of Elphick with a woman in robes. I thought of Rawdon's crossword clue, unfinished. Silence, bound by trust, and of the plaque beneath the organ bench, dedicated to Helen Garside, who sang even when no one listened. I laid the page on the stand and stared at it until the words blurred. Then I noticed something else. A faint indentation on the paper's reverse, where a pen had pressed too hard. Not letters, not fully, but the beginnings of one. An H, perhaps, or an N. I took a pencil from my pocket and shaded lightly across the surface. Slowly, like a ghost revealing itself, the rest emerged, a name half sketched, half effaced. Helen. Lewis watched, uncomfortably. He asked what it meant. It meant, I said, that Elphick had not been speaking only of Marlowe or Middleton. He had been rehearsing a confession, or an accusation, perhaps both. We sat a while in the wooden pews. The light through the high windows had gone entirely, leaving the room in a shade that seemed less like darkness than the absence of permission to see. Lewis muttered that it was strange, hiding something in an organ. I told him it wasn't strange at all. Instruments are made for resonance. A note concealed there waits, like any other, to be struck into sound. On our way out, I paused by the hymn board. The numbers from Evensong had not been removed. One of them, 317, caught my eye. A hymn I half remembered from childhood. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. A hymn about endings, about holding on in silence. A coincidence, perhaps. Or perhaps Oxford arranges even its coincidences with care. I folded the note once more and slid it into my coat. Outside, the bells had resumed their duties, each strike measured, obedient, untroubled. Yet I knew, as surely as I knew the misquoted line, that silence had not finished with us yet. It was Lewis who brought me the name, though it came folded in the middle of a sentence that had little to do with anything. He'd been going through old college newsletters, an exercise I'd abandoned years ago for fear of stumbling upon my own past. And there, tucked between a charity organ recital and a note on renovations to the senior common room, was a brief announcement. Gregory Fane returns to Oxford this Michaelmas as visiting fellow in contemporary ethics. The word ethics can mean almost anything in Oxford. Sometimes it means remorse, buried carefully beneath endowment. Sometimes it means nothing at all. Fane. I knew the name, of course. Most of us did, or had once. He had been a student here in the early 90s, dazzling, directionless, and widely disliked in the quietest, most persistent ways. He had written essays like riddles, dressed like a man waiting to be photographed, and left the university under a cloud thick enough to choke on. The record said academic incompatibility. Oxford's preferred euphemism for scandal. And now, 2 decades later, he was back. I found him in the faculty guest house on Canterbury Road, a Victorian edifice with too many gables and a smell of lavender that refused to die. He answered the door as though I had interrupted something, though the room behind him was empty, save for a bottle of white wine sweating in a silver cooler and a yellow legal pad with the words, "The Ethics of..." Silence, underlined twice. He recognized me immediately, which I found both flattering and suspicious. He offered me a drink. I declined. He smiled, that academic smile, half amused, half insulated. Said he'd heard about Marcus. Tragic, though not entirely shocking. Said the dean had written to him not long before his death. Invited him to speak. Reconciliation, perhaps, or confession. I asked whether he still had the letter. He said he'd burned it. Said Oxford had taught him to destroy things before they became evidence. He laughed. I didn't. I asked whether he'd known Helen Garside. The name landed, not heavily, but precisely. He took a long pause. Said he remembered her voice. Said he hadn't thought of her in years, which in Oxford usually means quite the opposite. Then, as if tired of my presence, he walked to the window. Said Elphick had been brilliant, yes, but frightened. Said the lecture wasn't about drama at all. It was about what they'd done, what they hadn't. That silence, in the end, was their greatest crime. I asked what he meant. He said I'd have to decide that for myself. On the way out, I noticed a book on the table. A thin volume of marginal Jacobean verse, spine cracked, corners dog-eared. I turned it gently. The flyleaf had an inscription, "To Marcus," for the silences we shared. No signature, but the ink was pale, greening at the edges. Old, not ancient, just old enough to have meant something once. Lewis met me outside. He asked what I thought. I told him Fane was the kind of man who speaks most clearly when he thinks you've stopped listening. Lewis frowned. Said he didn't trust him. I said neither did I. But trust isn't what opens the door, it's what waits behind it. Later, back at the station, I looked again at the quotation from Elphick's lecture. The altered one. Whoever loved that, loved not at first silence. I searched the source. Marlowe, yes, but the original was sight, not silence. Then I found it, in a footnote of a footnote, Fane's own dissertation. He had quoted it wrongly, deliberately, he claimed, to make a point about how silence seduces. Elphick had used the same misquote, which meant he'd read it, or been reminded of it, which meant they had spoken, recently, or often, which meant the past was not past at all. Not yet. Some errors aren't really mistakes. They're signals. Quiet flags planted in the middle of a field no one walks across anymore. Visible only from the right height or in the right light. The altered line from Marlowe had lodged itself into the side of my mind like a sliver. Too neat, too deliberate. Whoever loved that loved not at first sight. Not sight, a substitution, and substitutions, like confessions, only matter when you notice them. The quotation had appeared twice now. Once in Gregory Fane's student dissertation, and once, years later, in Elphick's final lecture draft. I've seen footnotes used as daggers before, but never as olive branches. There was a conversation hidden in the echo, a call, and then, perhaps, an answer. I spent the morning with a black coffee that had long since abandoned its heat and a sheaf of crumbling departmental correspondence that smelled faintly of ink and envelope glue. I'd asked Lewis to find anything at all that connected Elphick and Fane outside the obvious. The records had been cleansed, as most are when reputations must survive past scandal. But one document had slipped the purge, a scheduling notice for a private seminar in 1993. Elphick, Rawdon, Fane, and Garside. The fourth name returned with the uncomfortable chill of something that should never have been forgotten. Helen Garside, the girl whose plaque still rested beneath the chapel organ like a soft accusation. Her name had surfaced and receded in whispers. No official record of her leaving. Just an absence, unexplained. I asked the college archivist whether minutes from that seminar existed. He said they wouldn't. That private seminars were never recorded. His tone was neutral. Too neutral. The kind that grows in offices with locked cabinets and short memories. Later that day, I walked the perimeter of the quad and found myself at the library. Not the Bodleian, All Saints' Own, with its peculiar silence that seemed denser than usual. The scent of dust there has a particular pedigree, a scent that speaks of years when no one opened a certain book, or when something had been shelved, not alphabetically, but strategically. I requested the Dean's carrel key. No one questioned me. Inside the carrel, I found the quotation notebook again, the one we had taken from his rooms. I hadn't looked closely before. This time I did. Its entries were alphabetized, roughly. Blake beside Bronte, Pope tucked beneath Plato. But it wasn't the authors that interested me. It was the annotations. One in particular, beside the Marlowe misquote, had been scribbled in the Dean's unmistakable hand. Not error, intention. A line rewritten to fit the crime. I sat down slowly. A line rewritten, not misremembered, not misattributed. He had borrowed Fane's error deliberately. A nod, perhaps, or a warning. There was more. Tucked into the back cover, not folded, not hidden, but simply ignored, was an envelope with a clipping from the Oxford Student, dated 1993. The headline, "Promising Voice Withdraws from Term Concert." The article was brief, almost disinterested. Helen Garside had stepped down for personal reasons. No follow-up, no questions. But what startled me wasn't the article. It was the photograph beneath it. 4 figures, Elphick, Rawdon, Fane, and Helen, smiling. But something was wrong. A 5th shoulder, barely in frame, had been cropped, not carefully, crudely. The edge torn, the angle unnatural. Someone else had been in the picture once. I stared at the shape, at the faint suggestion of a sleeve. Academic robes, perhaps, and thought again of Clara Jesson's sighting in the quad, a woman arguing with Elphick near the bell tower. Rawdon? The thought hovered but didn't settle. Lewis rang as I stepped back onto the quad. Said the registrar had finally confirmed it. The redacted beneficiary in Elphick's will. Not a relative. Not a college. A private citizen. A Miss C. Jesson. I stood still for a long time, staring at the chapel roof as if the slate tiles might rearrange themselves into explanation. Clara, the choir girl with the voice that folded into silence, the girl who had refused to sing from the tower. Love, Elphick had once said, is only ever clear in its absence. The bells chimed behind me. 7 o'clock. Too late for revelation, too early for certainty. But something had shifted. And in Oxford, even a misquote can be louder than the truth. I've always believed there are different species of silence. There's the kind found in libraries, of course. Tame, obedient, disturbed only by the whisper of pages turning. There's the silence between two people who no longer know what to say. And then there is the silence that is chosen, crafted deliberately, like a final paragraph left blank. That was the kind we were dealing with now. Strange had called, said the preliminary toxicology was back. Elphick had ingested a significant quantity of phenobarbital, not impossible to come by, but not easy either. I asked whether it matched anything found in his rooms. Strange hesitated, said no, which meant it came from somewhere else, or someone else. I sat alone in my flat that evening. A Bach partita murmured through the stereo with the discipline of a dying clock. The notes neither resolved nor wandered. I stared at the beneficiary document again. Clara Jesson. 18 months in the choir. 6 months under Elphick's patronage. And now, heir to his personal library, his annotated lecture drafts, and, more curiously, a private endowment set aside for the continuance of unrecorded music. Unrecorded music. A phrase that wouldn't leave me alone. It sounded noble, or lonely, perhaps both. Lewis knocked around 9. He'd been to the archives, said he'd found something, not in the files, but in a forgotten cabinet in the bursarial corridor. An envelope marked simply, Garside. Inside, a single document, a formal letter of complaint. Typed, undated, unsigned. Accusations of impropriety. Vague but pointed. Against Elphick and Fane. The name Helen is mentioned once without a surname. Then nothing. No follow-up. No investigation. Just a folded page that someone had placed quietly out of reach. I asked him who had access to that corridor in 93. He said the Bursar's office kept those keys. Only one holder at the time. Judith Rawdon. I remember walking back to college in the rain, not because I expected clarity, but because I needed to see the stone wet again, the way it darkens and holds the color of thought. Oxford is a city built for suspicion. Every door seems to know more than it should. Judith met me without surprise. She didn't offer tea. She never did. I told her what we'd found. Her expression didn't shift. She asked whether we planned to reopen anything. I said, perhaps. That depended on her. She moved behind the desk, a dancer's gesture worn thin by repetition. Said she had done what she thought was necessary, that Helen Garside had been unstable, that the accusations would have destroyed more than reputations. They would have dismantled careers, lives, the fabric of the college itself. Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted a framed photograph, the kind of detail people miss when speaking. I don't. I asked whether she had drugged Elphick. A pause. Then, no. Just a long conversation, a pleading one. She had tried to stop the lecture. Said he was going to say things best left unsaid. I asked about the bell tower. She looked up then, said he had asked her to meet him there, that the bells had always meant something to him, some old childhood memory she never fully understood. Said she took the key. Waited, but he never came. Not that night. I asked when, then. She didn't answer. Back outside, Lewis was leaning under the chapel eaves, smoking in defiance of college regulations. I asked him whether Clara had been interviewed again. He nodded. Said she was calm. Too calm. That she had described her last meeting with Elphick as brief a word that left too much room for sadness. Then he told me something else. Said he'd checked the porter's night log from Saturday. Elphick's room light had gone off at 11:43, but the chapel organ, which was wired through the same grid, had flickered at 12:06. Someone had been inside, playing or leaving something behind. I asked whether there was sound. He said no, just the faint hum of the circuit returning to rest. That, I told him, was the true silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything else. Grief, guilt, memory, pressing in like breath against glass. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. We stood there a while longer, beneath the weight of the bells above us, waiting for them to speak again. But they didn't. Some silences, I suppose. Stay chosen. The bells had rung for evensong, not with any great ceremony, not even in perfect time, but enough to remind the stones they were still being listened to. I stood at the edge of the quad as they faded, watching the final resonance unravel itself against the tower like thread coming loose from an old coat. Lewis had gone home. Said he was tired. He wasn't. He simply knew the investigation had ended, or at least that portion of it which would yield anything concrete. The rest, as is often the case in Oxford, would remain folded neatly into silence, like a letter never posted. I stayed. Sat in the chapel where it had begun. Not in any designated seat, not even near the front. I chose a pew where the view was obscured by a stone column. I didn't want to see the altar. I only wanted to listen. The choir had left long ago, their music trailing behind them like incense that hadn't quite found where to settle. The organ keys were still, the candles had guttered, and only the faint echo of shoes on flagstone remained in the chapel's memory. I thought of Clara, her voice threaded through all of this. Not loudly, never directly, but woven at the edges. That kind of presence. She had inherited the dean's papers now, officially, his library, his marginalia, his silence. I don't know whether she understood what it meant, or whether she wanted to. There are questions we don't ask because we already live with the answers. Helen Garside's name had not reappeared in any official report. She would remain a parenthesis in a history too polite to footnote its failures. And Elphick, whatever his final intention had been, had succeeded in preserving his contradictions. A will be redrafted, but unsigned. A lecture rewritten but undelivered. A truth rehearsed but never performed. Outside, the wind pressed gently at the stained glass windows, the kind of wind that doesn't want to enter, only to be acknowledged. I ran a hand along the back of the pew in front of me. The wood was old, varnish worn thin by the devout or the anxious. On the underside, someone had etched a line, crude, almost apologetic. I was here, that was all. No name, just the declaration. I thought of Rawdon, too, her clarity, her containment. She would remain in place, I imagined, untouched. Her authority was not the kind that frayed easily. When I'd last spoken with her, she had said one thing I hadn't yet shared with Lewis, that the silence had been agreed upon. Years ago. Not by all of them. Not at once. But gradually. Like snow accumulating on a roof. No one bothers to clear. And now it had melted slightly. Enough to reveal the outline beneath. But not the whole house. I don't know if Elphick died with guilt or with resolve. I don't know whether Rawdon's regret is real or rehearsed, or whether Fane returned for redemption or simply to see if the walls still remembered him. What I do know is this: silence had shaped them more than speech ever could. There was one detail, though, that still lingered. The crossword in Rawdon's office, the clue I hadn't solved at the time. 9 down, one held in trust, bound by silence. 6. Not faith, not a keeper. Tonight it came to me, unbidden, as the chapel darkened around me. Secret. 6 letters. Complete. It fit. I left the chapel slowly. The air had cooled and the lamps in the cloisters had flickered into life. A moth tapped lightly at the glass of one, as if hoping to be mistaken for light itself. At the lodge, the porter looked up from his paper. He didn't speak, just nodded. I nodded back. There are some rituals in Oxford that transcend speech. The bells would ring again tomorrow, precisely, obediently, and no one, walking past, would know they had ever fallen silent.